Modeling complex texture-like patterns can be tricky to create and subsequently work with. You're likely to end up with a lot of geometry to deal with. Today we're going to take a look at the first of 3 techniques that you might use if you find yourself needing to take on that challenge. So first up on the workbench is the work mat itself. I'm Jesse, and here are some solid ideas. Now, I just said that you're likely to end up with a lot of geometry, so that is something that you want to consider before you even start this process, especially if this part is going to be going into an assembly where you might have multiple instances that could definitely have an impact on performance, so you want to be conscious of that. If this is not a texture that you're going to be using to produce actual geometry or manufacture this, you might want to consider just using a decal or something that will be lighter weight and still represent the texture. That being said, there are definitely times that you would want to or need to actually model this geometry. If you're going to be molding this actual piece, that would be a great time to do that. So these techniques would apply in those cases. So we're going to take a look at 3 techniques over the next 3 videos. This one being what I'll call the easy method. And we'll take a look at this first, and that's going to be using the rib tool. The rib tool has a pretty cool little trick up its sleeve that makes it really nice for these types of applications. So we're going to be taking a look at that. And then in subsequent 2 videos, we'll take a look at what I'll call the intermediate mode, which is going to be using the fill pattern. And then we'll move on to what I'll call advanced, which is going to be using a multi-body approach. Now, don't get too scared off with any of those names, whether they're too easy or too hard for you. They will be applicable really to a lot of different scenarios, so just different methods, but I'll kind of give them a layered approach in terms of how easy or hard I think they might be, or how advanced they might be. So let's start off with the rib one in this video. This will be what we'll call the easy method, and this is the geometry that we're going to be creating, this kind of diamond-shaped pattern that looks sort of difficult to create, but ultimately is pretty straightforward. So we'll have a look at here. Now we'll go to the point of just creating this geometry, and in a following video we'll talk about how you would go about trying to get fillets on this type of geometry, because that can always be a challenge when you've got a lot of edges to deal with as well. We're not going to cover that in this video. We'll take a look at that later. So let's roll back initially and start from ground zero here, and we can just kind of recreate this from scratch. So we'll roll back to the point where we just have our pockets that we've created, and we want to fill in this pocket with the pattern that we're looking to create. Now with a rib has multiple end conditions, and that's the little trick that it has up its sleeve that I mentioned earlier. So what we want to do with the rib is start from the top of where the rib is going to be and work our way down. So the first thing I'll want to do is make some kind of reference that we can start ourselves off with that is above the bottom of this pocket. So we'll do that by creating a plane first, and then we'll work from that plane that's going to be the top of the rib all the way down. So I'll use a Q on my keyboard to bring up the planes, and I'll select the top plane, and then I'll just hold Control on my keyboard and drag that up to duplicate that plane. That will be parallel and make a new plane, and we can just set the spacing. I'll set that to 0.5. So 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the piece, and we'll say okay and accept that plane. So now we have a plane that's sort of in the middle of our pocket, and we can work our way back down with the rib tool. Now the rib tool works off of a sketch, so we'll need to create that first. I'll select that plane, hit the sketch tool, and we'll start off by creating our sketch that will be used to create this feature. Now the first thing I want to do to create this sketch is sort of mark off the middle of this pocket. We'll see that our origin is slightly higher than the center of this, and I want to just mark off the middle of this pocket so I can start with my sketch there. So the first thing I'll do is use my S key, and we'll use the drop down, and I'll select the center line, and I'll mark off kind of corner to corner where this is going to land. Now, one thing that you'll want to consider when you're making geometry like this is you see that I have fillets already here on the corners of this geometry. So you know, this might not actually be the wisest thing to mark this off from fillet to fillet, because fillets are things that tend to disappear in designs down the road. So if you were to delete these, then we're going to run into issues with this. For the sake of example, I'll be okay just marking this off, but it certainly is something you'd want to consider. Next thing we want to do is put in some geometry that will actually be usable to us. So we'll go back with the S key and we'll select the midpoint line. And from here, we'll mark from the middle, and we want to go perpendicular. So I'll pay attention to this a little bit as I move my cursor out, and I'll be looking for that little yellow box to give me an auto relation that's perpendicular to the line that I just drew. We'll say okay there. So we see we've got that relation already set. Now at this point, we have everything that we need. Now, normally you would be saying, hold on, we didn't fully define our sketch. If this makes you queasy, you can go ahead and fully define this. There's not a problem with fully defining this, but for the sake of purposes with the rib, we have an interesting scenario that's a little bit different than most of our features that we're creating in SOLIDWORKS. So if we take a look at this geometry here, we've got this little stub of a line here. And what is going to happen with the rib tool is it's got an end condition that goes straight down, and it also has secondary end conditions that work its way outwards, so along that linear direction as well. So what is an end condition? Well, an end condition is what we're always using to create a feature, and that defines the length or the depth of that feature as you create that. So if you're just creating a normal feature, say you're creating an extrude, that blind distance, if you're going 1 inch down, that's an end condition. That can be modified to other things as well. So you could do a blind distance, or you could do an up to surface, or up to next, or up to vertex, or some other reference in the model that will tell the feature where to terminate. What makes the rib itself unique is that it has 3 of those. So it's looking for where the bottom is, and it's also looking for both of its edges. So it's constantly monitoring how far it can go in all 3 directions. So that's a huge benefit to us in a case like this, where we're trying to have it fill a space. But also is something that we'll need to consider as we make some changes to this, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So let's say this is good enough for what we want. We'll exit this sketch. Again, this is going to work like a thin feature extrude, so it's going to be adding the thickness to the geometry that we already have. So this small little snippet of a line is all we need to make this happen. I'm going to use the D key on my keyboard to bring the confirmation corner to my cursor so we can exit out of this sketch. And we'll be on our way here. So D key, exit sketch. And from here, we will use the rib command. Now, rib you can find on the features toolbar right up here, or search for it using the S key, which is what I typically do. If it's not already customized there, if it's something you use a lot, maybe you've already got it customized. We'll select the rib tool, and that will launch us into the rib tool. And you can see it's already looking for where it's supposed to be going. So in this case, we have the rib pointing off to the right-hand side, which is not what we want. We want it to go down. So we'll come over and switch our extrusion direction to downwards. And let's rotate over here so we can see we're kind of off of a little bit tough to see what plane we're on, but we're off of the ground here, and it's searching downwards. And the only additional piece of information that we need to give this is how wide is the rib itself going to be. So what's the thickness? So we'll increase this thickness a little bit, say to 0.2. And we'll say okay. Now here's where the magic happens. It's going to find its way down, but you'll notice that the feature actually creates geometry that we didn't draw. So it finds its way all the way up to this edge, and it finds its way all the way down to that edge as well. And again, that's because of those additional end conditions. So what we can now do is take advantage of that fact and start moving this other places as well. So let's go ahead and we'll pattern this off to the other side. So I'll use my S key again, and I have my S key customized to include linear patterns, or all types of patterns, as a matter of fact. So we'll select linear pattern, but again, if you don't have that customized, you find that right on the features toolbar of the command manager. So we'll select our direction. Our direction I'm going to select is going to be just a face that's on the rib itself, so we can go diagonally outwards. So we can set that spacing, and we'll leave this on spacing and instances. We'll set our spacing to maybe 1 inch so we can push that up a little bit. Our features that we're going to be patterning is going to be the rib that we just created. If we grab a face on there. And 20 of those actually looks like that comes out about right. Must have been the last thing I was modeling. And we're going to do the same thing in the opposite direction. So we're going to use this nice little trick that SOLIDWORKS has to just say, do the same thing, but in the other direction. So I'll check on symmetric for our direction 2 and say, okay. Now, again, this will take advantage of the magic that the rib has, and you'll find that it's working its way all the way out and filling up this whole space. Now, what happened here? Okay, so this is something that we've got to consider when we're making these initial sketches. Let's go back and take a look at this sketch. I'll just turn it on from the tree so we can take a glance. And let's look normal to this sketch again. So this is something that's easy to keep an eye on when we're when we're working with the initial sketch, right, I see that this sketch here is within the bounds that I'm looking for it to find. This sketch is pretty short and it's within this bound up here. It's within this bound down here. So it's going to find its way all the way up and down, but it's a little bit harder to visualize what's going to happen to this sketch as it gets way out here. And you can see in this case, this sketch was maybe here, this endpoint ending here. It's now looking for its new bounds, which it finds to be up here. So it now continues all the way up and finds the correct bounds down here. So this is something that we have to be conscious of, especially when we're patterning this over long distances. Now, this is also the reason why I wanted to pattern this on this diagonal, because this makes life a little bit easier. Of course, we can set the width nicely because we know that actual offset distance between the two of those, rather than just patterning in a linear direction off to the left-hand side and the right-hand side. But it does make it a little bit easier. So that is something that you'll definitely have to consider, what your original sketch is and where it's going to land when we get to its final destination. Okay, so let's go back and we'll fix this and we'll see what we can do here. So we'll go back and edit this sketch once I get myself out of annotation mode here. We'll go in and edit this sketch. And I'm going to just make this a little bit shorter so that by the time it finds its way into the corner, it will find the proper bounds. So let's just drag this in a little bit. Now, again, you can dimension this if you want to be a little bit more exact with your process. I'm just going to shrink that in a little bit, use the D key on my keyboard and come back. And let's see if we've solved the problem. Okay, yep. So now once this smaller segment gets all the way out, it is now looking for this bound, it finds that bound, and it completes within there. So nice little superpower that the rib has, but again, something you have to be conscious of, especially if you're going to be trying to fill large spaces with it. Okay, so let's go back and we'll turn this sketch off and get this out of our way. Now we've gotten this one section of it, and that seems like something that we could then just flip over. But remember, the exact scenario that we just came into with that sketch now finding its bounds up here instead of where it was supposed to is going to happen if we flip this over to the other side as well. As soon as we mirror this over to the opposite side, it now has bounds all over the place for it to find. So there's, I'm sure, lots of tricky ways that we could go about solving that. In this case, we're calling this the easy method. So we'll go with the obvious solution, which is just move up in elevation a little bit and make a new set of ribs. And then we can just trim them back down to where they're supposed to go. So what I'm going to do to finish this pattern is just start a sketch on the top. You can make a new plane if you wanted to, but I don't think there's any reason to do that. So we'll create a new sketch here, and we're going to do exactly the same thing, but in the opposite direction. So we now have no bounds for this to find. So again, I'll use my S key, and we'll come back to the center line. We'll do the opposite, and we'll mark off the opposite corner. And from here down to here. That guy there. Perfect. And same thing again. S key, we'll use a center point line and midpoint line, excuse me. And we'll make this a short little segment there that is, again, short enough to know what we're doing there, and we'll catch our autorelation for perpendicular. Okay, so that looks good. That should do the trick. We'll exit our sketch. Hopefully that finds its way into the corner. And again, we'll use the rib tool. I'll just search for it again. And we'll do the same thing. We'll flip this over. Again, we want this to go straight down, and we're at the correct width that we want to keep. So we'll say okay, and we'll let this find its way across. Now again, because we're up above all of those other ribs, we don't have to worry about it running into anything anymore. It's just a little bit taller, right? So it finds its rib up here. As long as it's coincident or down within that recess, it's going to find its way all the way across. So let's do the same thing, and we'll pattern this again the opposite direction. We'll go back to our linear pattern, and we'll do the same pattern that we did, except in the opposite direction here. So for our pattern direction, we'll select this face here, and we'll leave the same settings. We'll do symmetric again in the opposite direction. We'll say okay, and we'll let that fill in the space, again slightly raised. All right, so this will now create that diamond pattern that we started off with, except that we've got this feature that's slightly higher. So again, now we can trim this back down, being the easy method. And again, this is a pretty bulletproof method. Oftentimes I will use this myself as well, of just bumping up a little bit and then cutting them back to where I need to go just to get the advantage of using those end conditions. And again, this is a benefit because as you look towards the corner, you're seeing all of these geometry actually being different pieces. So we would have to go in and draw all of those individual shapes if we wanted to do this manually, where the rib takes care of that for us. Now, the other thing to consider too is that if you are drawing this geometry, chances are you're going to be molding this. These faces on the edges might all be drafted, and same with the ribs. You may have noticed in there that the rib has the ability to draft as well. So that takes in another level of complexity that you don't have to worry about. Right? Those end conditions are just going out as far as they can in all three of those directions, and you don't have to worry about what that exact geometry is. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll cut this back out. I'm just going to use the sketch that we already created. So let's find that sketch. I'll use my breadcrumbs here, just selecting the D key again, and we'll find the original sketch that we used. I'll turn that on and we'll copy this off. We'll just create a sketch again on this top face. And I'll select this little region here, select chain. I'll use my shortcut toolbar and copy that over using convert entities. All right, from here we can use our D key to escape. And we'll turn this sketch back off since we don't need that anymore. Now we've got our sketch that we copied over. Again, in case this pocket changes shape, we can reference that. And we'll use our S key to grab our extruded cut. Again, all of these features available on the command manager. We'll grab our sketch because I selected the other sketch and we deselected this one in the process of doing that. And we can allow this to cut our way down. All right, so what we want to do is take this profile, cut it down to this level. Now we can do that a couple of ways. We can reference that. I mentioned that the rib uses those end conditions. This is where you would find those end conditions in an individual, say a cut extrude in this case, individual feature. So you'll see those end conditions listed here in this dropdown. So for example, we could do an up to surface in this case, and we could say, I want it to go up to the surface of this other feature that I have created. Right now, maybe the plane would be a smarter reference, right? We're referencing an individual face here that could potentially change, especially one that's this far out. If you decide to change the spacing of these and suddenly this finds itself wandering off and is no longer an instance anymore, maybe better to point it to a different reference. Again, that will be up to you as you're using this method. But the point is we can use an end condition again to reference that height. So if we reference this, the height of this plane, that's the height that sets the level of the other set of ribs. So we will be using that level to pull these back down from the top and clean up this geometry. There we go. Okay, so that was a lot of talking, but in the reality of things, as you're going through this process, really we created all of this geometry with two small stubs of a sketch and a couple of patterns. So pretty straightforward process. And again, all of that unique geometry that was created in all of these corners as it gets there was handled by the end conditions of the rib itself. Well, there you go. That's the first of 3 methods that we'll use to create this texture-like geometry from within this little pocket. In the next video, we'll take a look at this, which will be using the fill pattern to create this honeycomb-like shape that will fill in this area. We'll call this the intermediate, but to be honest, it's also pretty easy. So if you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, and I will see you over in that video.